My friends, once again, the world finds itself watching as Israel and Hamas sit, or more precisely, are made to sit, across the negotiating table. The setting this time is Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, a resort town that has hosted many peace talks before. The topic, of course, is the same haunting one that has occupied the Middle East and the conscience of the world for decades. The question of Gaza, of occupation, of security, of power, and of survival. But behind the news headlines about hostage swaps and ceasefire arrangements lies a much deeper story, one that isn't just military or diplomatic. It is economic, historical, and systemic. That's what I want to unpack with you today. 1. The immediate context. These negotiations mark the first direct, U.S.-backed effort to end the most recent Gaza war, a war that has devastated the region for nearly 2 years. Over 40,000 Palestinians are estimated to have been killed, entire neighborhoods in Gaza reduced to rubble, and Israel itself traumatized by the October 7 attacks and the ongoing captivity of hostages. The talks are described as indirect. Israeli and Hamas representatives are in separate rooms with mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, shuttling messages back and forth. The United States has proposed what is being called a 20-point framework, originally drafted under the Trump administration, but now re-endorsed by Washington. The central idea: an initial ceasefire, humanitarian access, phased Israeli withdrawal, and a hostage prisoner exchange, leading eventually to discussions about Gaza's governance. On paper, that sounds promising. But if you've followed the long, tragic history of this conflict, you know that paper promises have never been the problem. The problem is power. Who has it, who doesn't, and who decides what peace looks like? 2. The power dynamics beneath the table. Let's begin with Israel. Israel enters these talks from a position of both strength and weakness. Militarily, it dominates. Its armed forces can destroy, and have destroyed, much of Gaza's infrastructure. Economically, it benefits from U.S. aid that exceeds $4 billion annually. Politically, it has strong backing from the United States and several European countries. But the war has created fissures inside Israel itself. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces deep internal pressure, protests at home demanding a ceasefire and the release of hostages, opposition within his own coalition, which insists on continuing military operations until Hamas is eliminated, and growing international criticism over civilian casualties. So, Netanyahu comes to the table not as a unified leader, but as a man balancing between his far-right allies and a population exhausted by war. Now, Hamas enters from an even more complex position. It has survived nearly 2 years of bombardment and siege, but at a staggering cost. The leadership in Gaza operates under constant threat, much of its military and administrative structure destroyed. Yet politically, it remains a central actor, precisely because no one else can deliver peace without its cooperation. That's the paradox. Israel's goal of eliminating Hamas cannot coexist with negotiations that require Hamas's signature. So, while militarily weakened, Hamas's political relevance has, in a sense, been reinforced. Then there are the mediators: Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. Each has its own motives. Egypt fears instability at its border and the mass displacement of Palestinians into Sinai. Qatar host to much of Hamas's political leadership, wants to preserve its role as a diplomatic broker, and the United States, always the indispensable partner, is desperate to project control over a region that has grown increasingly skeptical of American promises. 3. The economic layer, war aid and dependency. Let's look at what rarely gets discussed: the economics. Every war is also an economy. Weapons are purchased, infrastructure is destroyed and rebuilt, and aid becomes both lifeline and leverage. Israel's economy, though strong, has taken a hit. Billions diverted to defense spending, disrupted tourism, rising inflation, and political uncertainty have all shaken investor confidence. Meanwhile, Gaza's economy is virtually non-existent. Unemployment near total, industries flattened, trade cut off. The population depends almost entirely on humanitarian aid. And aid, we must remember, is never neutral. It comes with conditions, with controls, and with political calculations. When the United States or the European Union pledges reconstruction funds, they are not simply offering charity. They are purchasing influence, shaping governance structures, and determining which factions will hold power in a post-war Gaza. Thus, the rebuilding phase that these negotiations promise is not purely humanitarian. It's a continuation of politics by other means. Hamas, too, depends on these flows of external money from Qatar, Iran, and sympathetic networks across the Middle East. This financial dependence is both a source of survival and a leash. It limits autonomy, dictates timing, and makes every negotiation not just about land, but about funding. 4. The U.S. role, strategy, or stagecraft. Washington's involvement deserves a closer look. The Biden administration, under immense domestic and international pressure, has revived a version of the Trump plan for Gaza, a plan that had been widely criticized for being one-sided in favor of Israel. Yet, it has been repackaged as a comprehensive peace framework. Why now? Because the U.S. faces credibility erosion across the global South. Nations that once viewed Washington as a stabilizing force now see double standards. Swift condemnation of Russia's war in Ukraine, but far more cautious language about Israel's actions in Gaza. These negotiations give the White House an opportunity to reclaim moral authority without fundamentally challenging its alliance with Israel. In other words, this is as much about optics as it is about outcomes. By presenting itself as peacemaker, Washington aims to quiet global criticism, reassure Arab partners, and maintain control over a region vital to its energy and security interests. The substance of peace, however, remains subordinated to the performance of diplomacy. 5. The core sticking points. As reports from Egypt indicate, 6 main disputes dominate the talks. The pace of Israeli withdrawal. Israel insists that any withdrawal from Gaza must come only after security guarantees. Hamas demands that withdrawal precede disarmament. This chicken and egg problem has stalled every prior negotiation. The question of disarmament. Israel's position: Hamas must disband militarily. Hamas's response: disarmament without sovereignty equals surrender. The gap between those positions remains vast. Governance of Gaza after the ceasefire. The U.S. plan envisions a transitional administration, possibly involving the Palestinian Authority under international oversight. Hamas fears this as a move to sideline it completely. Hostage and prisoner exchange. The most emotionally charged issue. Hamas holds Israeli hostages. Israel holds thousands of Palestinian prisoners. Both sides demand the other act first. Humanitarian access and reconstruction. Israel demands inspection mechanisms to prevent materials from being used for military purposes. Aid agencies argue that such restrictions make rebuilding impossible. Internal political divisions. In both camps, factions oppose compromise. In Israel, far-right ministers threaten to collapse the coalition if Hamas remains intact. Within Palestinian politics, some accuse Hamas of negotiating from weakness, others of endangering future unity. These disputes make progress painfully slow, and yet, mediators describe the atmosphere as cautiously positive, meaning no breakthroughs, but no collapse either. 6. The broader historical echo. To understand why these negotiations matter, we have to step back, decades back. This conflict is not simply about territory or religion. It's about a colonial legacy, the unresolved displacement of Palestinians in 1948, and the global politics that followed. Since the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, the peace process has become a kind of theater, negotiations without resolution, treaties without enforcement. Each round promises a new beginning, and each ends with more settlements, more walls, more despair. For Israel, the occupation became normalized, part of its security doctrine. For Palestinians, resistance became the language of survival. And for the international community, periodic peace talks became a ritual, something to announce, to applaud, and to forget. This current round, therefore, is not just another episode. It's a test of whether the cycle can finally be broken, or whether diplomacy will once again serve as a pause between wars. 7. The human cost. And the media narrative. While leaders debate terms, the people of Gaza live through catastrophe. Hospitals without medicine, families displaced multiple times, children growing up under drones and rubble. Meanwhile, the Israeli public lives under constant fear of attacks and political fragmentation. Yet, global media coverage tends to flatten this human suffering into numbers, casualty counts, and airstrike totals, losing sight of the lived reality behind those figures. That's why these negotiations, while geopolitical in appearance, are deeply moral in substance. They are about whether human life can still command priority over strategic advantage. 8. Regional ripples. The new Middle East chessboard. Beyond Gaza, the entire region watches carefully. Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt want calm, not necessarily justice, but stability. Iran views these talks with suspicion, worried that any deal could weaken its influence over Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Turkey positions itself as a champion of Palestinian rights while maintaining complex trade ties with Israel. In short, the Middle East is not uniting for peace, it's recalibrating for interests. That's the tragedy of modern geopolitics. Every actor claims to seek peace, but each defines peace as the continuation of its own influence. 9. The structural lesson. Capitalism and conflict now. Let's talk about something Richard Wolff himself would emphasize: the structural economics of war. Modern capitalism has always thrived on crisis. Wars justify massive public spending, revive stagnant industries, and allow governments to expand surveillance and control under the banner of security. For Israel, The defense sector is a key pillar of the economy, exporting technology, intelligence systems, and military hardware worldwide. For the United States, every Middle Eastern war sustains the military-industrial complex. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, all reporting record profits during conflict years. Even reconstruction, the rebuilding of Gaza, becomes a business. Contracts go to international corporations, materials supplied by foreign firms, often under restrictive terms that keep local economies dependent. In that sense, perpetual instability is profitable, and that is why genuine peace is so elusive. It threatens established interests, both political and economic. 10. The path forward, and what to watch. So, where do we go from here? If the negotiations yield even a partial ceasefire, it will be hailed as progress. Hostages may be released, aid may flow, but a sustainable peace requires far more: an end to occupation, a recognition of Palestinian sovereignty, a political settlement that goes beyond managing violence to addressing justice. That means confronting hard truths, not only for Israel and Hamas, but for the global powers that sustain this conflict with weapons, money, and silence. As we monitor these talks, here's what to watch: whether Israel agrees to a verifiable timetable for withdrawal, whether Hamas gains any role in post-war governance, how reconstruction funds are distributed, who gets contracts, who gets oversight, whether international actors like the EU or China step in to balance U.S. dominance. Each of these signals will tell us whether this is real negotiation or merely another performance of diplomacy. 11. What peace really requires? Peace, ultimately, is not signed on paper. It is built in systems, in the economic, social, and political arrangements that shape daily life. For Palestinians, that means freedom from blockade and dignity in self-determination. For Israelis, that means security without perpetual war. For the world, it means ending the hypocrisy of preaching peace while profiting from its absence. The negotiations in Egypt may not resolve decades of pain, but they expose, once again, the fundamental choice before humanity: to continue managing conflict for the benefit of the few, or to confront the injustices that make conflict inevitable. If there is any lesson here, it is this: real peace requires not just ceasefires but courage. The courage to rethink power, profit, and the very structure of our world order. So as we watch these talks unfold, let's look beyond the slogans, beyond the staged photo ops. Let's ask who gains, who loses, and who decides what peace will mean. Only then can we move from headlines to understanding, and from understanding, perhaps, to change.